And how does one think about testing this stuff? So the challenge with testing JavaScript is, well, there's a number of challenges, but in terms of the environment in which it runs, when you're testing, let's say, your Rails code, there is an environment in which the functions that you're testing expect to run. So for example, if you're testing some method in your active record model, the expectation is Rails has been fired up. There is a database out there. It's just the test database, but it's a database. Active record methods that do queries will work against that database. So in some sense, those are implicit preconditions, right? They're the environment in which your tests are expecting to be run, because that's the environment in which the code being tested would be run. The comparable thing for JavaScript, if you're writing a browser-based app that has a heavy JavaScript component, is that JavaScript is expecting to be run in the browser. And that means a bunch of things. It means, for example, that the JavaScript expects there to be a browser global object through which it can get to the document, and it can get to the DOM tree and all those other things. Also, most JavaScript that you write in the context of this client side of a SaaS application has dependencies on HTML elements, right? So even my simple example of when you check the select all checkbox, all the ones underneath it get checked. And if I uncheck it, then all the ones underneath become unchecked. Even that simple behavior assumes that the top checkbox exists and that one or more of the other checkboxes exist. So you have to essentially figure out a way for JavaScript code to be tested by other JavaScript code, but within the environment in which the code under test is going to be run. And the way Jasmine solves this, it just runs your tests in a browser. There's a gem that you install. You start the Jasmine quote-unquote server. And basically now, whenever you visit this special port on localhost, what it will serve is a page constructed by Jasmine that contains all of the code required to run your tests. And if you reload that page, it's like rerunning all of your tests, because when you reload the page, you get a new global object, et cetera, et cetera. So the question is, in this context, how do you actually write your tests? And in particular, the tests have to be running so that they see the same kind of page as when they'd be running in real life. Right? If you're testing the little checkbox behavior, then that test has to believe that it's actually on a page where all those checkboxes exist. Otherwise, the test can't do anything. So the key idea that I want you to get about Jasmine, or really any testing framework that is useful for JavaScript, is how does it do that? To understand what Jasmine looks like, if you have acquired, and I hope by now you have acquired, some level of comfort at least reading RSpec code, if not necessarily writing a lot of your own, Jasmine is the same. In fact, it was deliberately designed to look just like RSpec because the people who designed it are fanatics of RSpec, and they wanted testing in JavaScript to feel as natural as RSpec feels to them. So, in RSpec, one of the things that you do is you have a group of examples under a heading like describe. And each example begins with the word it. It has a documentation string, and then it has a block of code that actually runs the example. Well, remember, in Ruby, what is a do block? A do block is actually a callable thing. It's like an anonymous function, right? And indeed, in JavaScript, the Jasmine version of that is exactly this. You have describe. The first argument is a string describing what you're testing, and then an anonymous function inside of which are actually all the specific test cases related to that block. So the first argument to it is a particular behavior, and the second argument is an anonymous function that implements the test that actually does that behavior. So it's almost exactly symmetrical with RSpec. Just as with RSpec, if you need to set up preconditions, in RSpec you can say something like before each, and then you pass it what? A function, right? An anonymous function that should be run to set up some common preconditions before each test case runs. Same thing in Jasmine, except they've changed the syntax a little. They just say before each, and you pass it an anonymous function that is responsible for doing any setup common to the tests. What else do you have in specs? You have expectations. You have assertions about things that the test expects to see and that it can check. In RSpec, you can say something like expect some expression to equal something, to be greater than something, to be true, to be false. Same thing in Jasmine. You can say expect some JavaScript expression to equal something, to be truthy or falsy. If the expression refers to a DOM element, you can say things like, I expect this element to be hidden, as in not visible to the user. I expect this element to have a particular CSS class, or not to have a particular CSS class. I expect the element to contain certain text. So all of these things, it's basically expectations that have to do with JavaScript itself, like equal, greater than, less than, truthy, and a collection of expectations that specifically have to do with tests that you might want to perform against the DOM. So what other expectations? You can say things like, I can expect an element to be selected or not, a checkbox to be checked or not, things to be visible, disabled, et cetera, to have certain classes, to have a particular attribute, like an href attribute with a particular value. So if I were testing the part of the example that I just walked through, one of the things that I would want to test is that if the user clicks the close button on the pop-up, it makes the pop-up go away. So what does that mean in terms of Jasmine? Here's my example. The doc string says it hides the movie div, and the anonymous function says, here's the element, the actual button that is visible to the user. I constructed my page so that that element is a link, and its ID is well known to be this word, hide. And I'm going to have JavaScript trigger the event. Right? So basically, I'm saying, find this element. And if my page is working, I know this element exists. And essentially, make it seem like the user just clicked on the element. Right? So notice what I'm not doing. Right? I am not saying, find this element and arrange to call my event handler. I'm just saying, find the element and arrange for the user to click on it. This is kind of like in Cucumber when you say, when I press something or other, it's now up to the logic on the web page and your server to actually make sure that the right thing happens in response to the event. So same thing here. All I can do here is trigger the event. If my setup code all worked correctly, the result of that should be that my handler gets called and the handler makes the pop-up go away. How would I test if it actually happened? Well, I can grab here's a CSS expression that matches the pop-up. I will wrap it in jQuery $ to say, find the element that matches the CSS selector and expect it to be hidden. Right? So in order for this test to pass, various things have to happen. Right? Clicking on this element actually has to be bound to an event handler that gets successfully called. That event handler has to successfully locate this pop-up box and do whatever is necessary to make it go away so that the to-be-hidden expectation works out. Right? Now, again, things like this are simple enough that if you do test them, you can probably add a line to your Cucumber scenario and it'll just work. But in terms of giving you the idea, the pattern of the test is I will simulate the event that the user would do, and then I will check that the overall result of that event is what I expected it to be. Right? And there's a number of things that could happen in between. I can also do more complicated tests that have to do with things like AJAX. So when we talked about stubs and doubles and mocking the internet, one of the examples we gave is, what if your app relies on calling an external API? In testing, you don't want the test to really call that API. Instead, you want to intercept that call and possibly return a predetermined value, like a value that simulates success, a value that simulates failure. So now the same thing applies. If you want to test AJAX code in your web page, you don't want the test to actually call the server every time. Or to put it another way, if you wanted a test that calls the server every time, what you really want is an integration test. Right? What you really want is a test that all the way from the user clicking to the server doing something exercises the whole path. But if what you're trying to test is whether the JavaScript code in your client is going to do the right thing at all, you can do the same trick that we did for doubles in RSpec. In Jasmine, for various reasons, they're actually called spies. So we can create a spy that essentially replaces a real method. So the spy behaves like a method stub. The only condition is that for this piece of machinery to work, the method that we want to stub has to be a property of an existing object. So what this says is, on the movie pop-up object, that was my single top-level JavaScript object, it's expecting that there is a slot, a property of that object called new, and the value of that property is a function. That's what allows the spy mechanism to work. Because internally, you can kind of imagine what's going to happen here. Jasmine is going to find this object. It's going to see whether the object has a slot with that name, and ideally, that slot is function valued. That means that because functions are first-class objects in JavaScript, Jasmine can hold on to that function and temporarily replace the definition of that slot in the object with its own spy. The spy gets called in place of the real function, and then you can decide what you want to do after the spy has been called. For example, just like in RSpec, you can say spy on the function, and when it's called, return some canned value. You can also say spy and call through. What does that mean? It means the spy gets called, the spy registers the fact that the call happened, and then it allows the call to go to the real function. So it's basically, if you want to check that it was called, and then also allow it to do its thing, you could say and call through. You could also say and call fake. So when the spy gets called, here is a function that I want you to call instead. And that function will in some way provide a canned behavior that is similar to what the real function would have done. So the spy itself doesn't do anything, but you tell the spy when it gets called which of these three things it should take. And by the way, no quotes around movie popup here, because movie popup is actually just a variable, right? I set a top-level global variable name in JavaScript to be that object containing my different slots. One of the slots was new, so new is a slot name. That's why it's in quotes here. Example calls on spy. I can say, once the test has run, I can say, expect that the most recent time that this thing was called, its arguments contained a particular thing, right? So this most recent call is basically a functionality provided by the spy. Once I have set up my spy and I have triggered whatever event I believe is going to cause the new function to be called, I can, after the fact, as part of my post conditions, I can check whether the most recent call, as recorded by the spy, had arguments that contained a particular thing. I can also say things like, the last time I called an AJAX function, I want to make sure that, so here's a way to test, when I call AJAX, is it generating the correct route to make the AJAX request to the server? And I might check that by saying, I'll set up a spy on AJAX, and then I can ask, when AJAX was most recently called, the first argument to AJAX had a URL slot, and did that URL have the right value? So this would be a way that you can test if you've got some pretty complicated flow where the end of the flow is you have an AJAX call to some long route with a lot of parameters. This is the kind of test code you might write to inspect if, under different conditions, the correct route is being constructed. Now, at this point, we have not yet talked about stubbing what actually goes to, we haven't talked about stubbing the AJAX call itself, but I will talk about that momentarily. What about the idea that AJAX code or Jasmine code tests has to run in the environment that the real code would be running in? So one of the things about real JavaScript is that it expects certain elements to exist on the page because those are the elements that that particular JavaScript code is supposed to operate on. So Jasmine provides a notion of what's called HTML fixtures, which is for each test that you write, you can provide just enough HTML to allow the JavaScript to do what it's supposed to do. So for example, if you have some piece of JavaScript you're trying to test and it expects to find a table of movies, what you do is you could create like a minimal table that has the correct ID, and maybe the rows of the table have the correct classes, but it's basically just enough small fake data that when your JavaScript code goes to look for this table, it will find it, right? Because it's not going to be running in the context of the overall page that is served from your app. It's basically running in this like little fake environment that you create. So for every single JavaScript test, if it expects to operate on the DOM, you have to provide just enough of the DOM in order for it to be able to do that. And there's a cool trick that the textbook shows that you can essentially, from running your app and having it generate real pages, you can extract HTML fixtures in an automated way almost for free. So in your Jasmine tests, you would put each of these chunks of HTML that is supposed to provide an environment for a particular test into its own little file. And then in the appropriate test, you would say load fixtures of that file. Jasmine will load that into a special div, which it automatically clears out. So if you've got a lot of different tests trying to load a lot of different fixtures, each test will begin with a clean slate. Kind of like every new RSpec or every new Cucumber scenario begins with a clean copy of the database. So how do you put these things together to actually do a stub, right? So what if you want to test an AJAX interaction, meaning that you've got some code that under certain conditions will make an AJAX call to the server returns something, and the code is supposed to do something with what's returned. It's going to modify the DOM or whatever. And the goal is, how do you have a test for that that is isolated from the actual server part, so that you're really just testing whether your client-side JavaScript works correctly. And as a reminder, on the bottom is kind of how we did this when we started talking about RSpec and stubbing the internet. If you remember, we had this method where the controller was supposed to just call some method in the model. We wanted to isolate the controller test from the correctness of that method. So we just basically created a stub for the method. And we could say, as soon as that method is called, just use the stub to return a fake value. That was one way to stub it. But we also said, if you wanted to be more realistic than that, you could actually stub the model using something like fake web, and you would get all the way to the HTTP library, and then you would return something that looks just like what the remote API would return. So now you're actually testing the entire code path. You're not just sort of isolating the controller test. Right? So those were cases that when we talked about, what is the appropriate place to stub a test interaction, and you have to make those same kinds of choices in the client. So in the example that I just walked through, there was this function called getMovieInfo that would be triggered when the user clicked on the name of a movie. And the result of that was that the handler for that would do an AJAX call to the server. The server, if you would let the path run all the way through, the server would run the movie's controller show action. It would realize that it's going to return a little HTML chunk. The HTML chunk would come all the way back, and then showMovieInfo would do something with it. Where can you stub that test? Well, one thing you can do is you can stub right at the AJAX call. You can basically say, I don't want to let the AJAX call happen. So I will wait until my handler tries to make the AJAX call. At that point, I can see the URL, I can see the parameters, I can see the HTTP method, so I can verify that it's doing the right thing. And if so, I want to return a canned value. Just like when I'm sort of stubbing down here, as soon as I realize that the right call was made, I will stop things at that point and return a value to the caller and let the test proceed. However, once again, because JavaScript has this asynchronous model, it's not quite so easy to do. In particular, we can't just sort of stub the AJAX function and say, as soon as the AJAX function is called, return this chunk of HTML as a fake response. The reason we can't just do that is because the AJAX function itself doesn't return anything. Well, that's not true. It returns a token. But the AJAX function, remember how the AJAX function works. It kicks off the request to the server. It returns immediately. And sometime later, when the server replies, the appropriate callback that was part of the AJAX call will be triggered. So it's split into two pieces. So we have to actually do the same thing here. That means that if we're going to stub the AJAX call, we can spy on the AJAX call, and we can provide a fake method whose only job is to call the success callback. Right? So if you think about if this was really running, how would it look from the JavaScript point of view? It looks like AJAX gets called, it fires off a request, it twiddles its thumbs. Sometime later, the success method gets woken up and saying, oh, it was successful, here's the data. So that's actually the behavior that we need to fake out. That's the behavior we need to stub. Right? So we can't just return a fake value from AJAX, because the AJAX call is not the thing that provides what the client is expecting. What the client is expecting has to come from the server, and the way the client gets it is the browser will receive the response from the server and then call the success function. So that's why we have to use call fake for things like this. And that's, again, one of the things that makes JavaScript client-side testing a little convoluted, is I can't just return the fake object. I have to arrange to call a fake function that calls my success function. That's what's going to make it look like the server actually was successful and returned a piece of code to the client. So if I'm just walking through how the code is supposed to work in real life, at some point when the user clicks on the right movie title, getMovieInfo will be called. It will immediately try to do an AJAX call using whatever the URL was associated with the link that the user clicked on. And if the response is successful, it will call this showMovieInfo, right? So that's the code we walked through before. So now if we show how would we test all of that, so I can actually test various things about it. One of the things I can test is the setup. So remember that I said that the page starts out life as having this placeholder empty div element that's going to be filled in later. Well, I can check whether it's present. I can check whether the movie info div exists, because if not, it's going to be a sad, sad day when I get a response from the server and I say, replace the movie info div with this content, and the movie info div is not there. I can also check that besides existing, it is also hidden, right? So that's sort of the standard initial conditions. Then the more interesting part is I can describe what happens if the user clicks on a link in that movie table. That's the thing that's supposed to trigger requesting the info for that movie by AJAX and then popping up a little box to show it. Well, I've got a before each saying for each of these specifications, I first need to make sure that it's running in an environment that looks like the real page that that code would be running on. So I'm going to load that little fixture that I showed on the previous slide, which is like a movies table that has one row, but all of the correct elements with the correct CSS classes and everything are in there. So once that is in place, I can check various things about the behavior of the code. For example, I want to check if when the user clicks on the name of a movie, does the client attempt to make the correct AJAX call? So how do I do that? I spy on the actual AJAX call, right? Spy on, the first argument is the object. The second argument is the function valued property slot. In this case, the object is the jQuery object itself, which is where AJAX is defined, right? So I'm going to spy on AJAX, and when I actually trigger a click on a link, in other words, I'm simulating the user clicking on that link, I expect at that point that the most recent call to AJAX will have a first argument whose URL equals the right thing. Right? Again, this is a simple example to do a test for, but this is how you get the idea of how you think about these tests. Then I also want to check, OK, what happens if the AJAX call goes to the server, everything is happy, the server returns some little blob of HTML, and it's supposed to now display that in a pop-up window. So again, I have to set up a fixture, a little blob of HTML that looks like the part of the page the JavaScript code would normally expect to see. I'm going to spy on the excuse me, on the AJAX function again, but this time the spy will call fake. So the AJAX call gets made, it gets intercepted by the spy. Now the spy is going to forward that call to this function that I just put in. What does this function do? It directly calls success. So my little call fake function is going to be passed whatever the AJAX function originally was passed, right? That's kind of what the spy does. So part of what the AJAX original function was passed was the name of the success function, the name of the failure function, the callbacks. So my call fake is just going to call a function that immediately calls the success function, and it provides this little canned piece of HTML. So it's essentially simulating what would happen if the server had generated that HTML, successfully returned it back to the client, and now the browser goes, ah, success. I will now call the success function and pass it the thing that the server served me. So this is basically the stub point, right? We've checked that the AJAX got called. We've checked that the arguments to AJAX were correct. And we've checked that given that we allow the AJAX call to proceed, if we now return some canned content, we can verify that that content results in being correctly displayed in the div. We can check that various other pieces of HTML on the page, like the movie title, got updated correctly. So this is the sort of JavaScript testing flow. And I think you can kind of see why testing this stuff is a little bit of a bear. If most of what you're doing is client-side sort of traditional HTML pages that are enhanced by JavaScript with things like select all boxes and stuff like that, these tests are not that painful to write. And like I said, you can also do a lot of that checking in cucumber scenarios, which some people find easier to read and write. But if you have sort of non-trivial JavaScript logic in the client side, expect to have to test it and expect to have to think of your tests sort of in this split brain syndrome. So that's kind of, oh, sorry, I'm back in Miro here. So that's kind of an overview of how to think about not only writing JavaScript in AJAX code, right? Hopefully you have this basic idea, which is that everything you do has to be split into pieces that are non-blocking. So the moment you're going to do something long-running, the pattern is, OK, expect to pass functions around so that when that long-running operation eventually completes, the appropriate function will get called depending on how things turned out. And I'll have more to say about frameworks, I hope, on Tuesday. But things like promises in ES6 are intended to capture this notion of, like, I want to do a long-running thing, and I want to provide success and failure functions, but I need like a whole chain of those things, right? So I've got like 4 long-running things in a row. And if I was writing straight-line code, it would be like if, else, if, else, if, else. but now I've got to write it as a bunch of pieces. So this new mechanism in ES6 called promises lets you at least textually keep all that code together. You still have to worry about, at debugging time, like keeping track of where you are. So it's a little bit difficult.